thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And I see a lot of familiar faces here today, which means to me that you can ask those sharp, pointed questions that you would have asked anyway, and I'll accept them and take them as only in the most constructive manner possible. So with that, what I think I'll do is start with three stories, three basically autobiographical short stories, and it'll set kind of the pace. Read a few passages from the book, and then we'll just have not so much question and answers, if you want question and answers, of course, but discussion. And what Sean said in his introduction is exactly what I tried to do. In a long career, it turns out to have been a long career now in retrospect, which at the time seemed like a series of jobs, it actually had a theme. And it's been 30 plus years since I went to work as editor of Near East Report, AIPAC's then weekly printed newsletter on the Middle East and U.S.-Israel relations. And the Washington Jewish Week and B'nai B'rith International Jewish Monthly, and then for 14 years at Camera before coming to the Jewish Policy Center. Looking at what increasingly looked to me like not a mistaken understanding of the Arab-Israeli conflict, or a story that the Post just got wrong because they had a few facts out of context, or they missed some background, or they went to an extreme source instead of finding a mainstream source. Year after year, place after place, observing, interacting, it began to dawn on me that what I was seeing was the resumption of a process. What was that process? It's famously said that the Holocaust began not with concentration camps and gas chambers. That's how it ended. It began with words, concepts, ideas, long before. And it moved from the compulsion, the justification or pretext for the compulsion, moved from the margins to the center. How did that happen? And it began to dawn on me that while the Nazi genocide of European Jewry stopped in 1945 with the defeat of the Axis, the compulsion to subordinate the Jews and then their state was only suppressed. And it was suppressed so strongly for the generation that fought World War I and World War II that we could assume almost subconsciously that anti-Semitism had been relegated to the margins. In fact, like a virus that is dormant, that was its condition, and it had never been relegated to the margins. It was center stage in the Middle East, in the Arab Islamic world, and it filtered from there back into Europe. And that's kind of, that's part of the chain, the process of how it happened. That's what I tend to describe in the book. And I have to say before I go a step further, there are two people right here in the room that pointed me to this understanding. And one is Sean, who introduced me. So Sean was my assistant for some years in the Washington office of Camera, my worthy, at the least, more than that, successor. Now, and Sean pointed me at some of the resources that would materialize in this book to support the theme. And Juliana Jared-Pilon, sitting right there, a noted author of very serious works in her own right, kind of showed me how to take this concept and keep it from being amorphous and like herding cats, and keep my thoughts on target and corralled. So without these two people sitting right here, this probably wouldn't have come to pass. Okay. And I want to thank Juliana also. There is this month now at the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs a very laudatory, detailed, supportive review of this book by Juliana. So thank you. Sean mentioned the shooting in Pittsburgh. That happened on October 27th. 5 days before, on October 22nd, New English Review Press released my book. The title, The Jews Make the Best Demons, Palestine and the Jewish Question. The demonization, as Natan Sharansky has said, anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism through the 3 Ds: demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. Probably should have put that in reverse order. Sean deals with, camera deals with double standards all the time. The media treatment of Israel versus the treating of the Palestinian Arabs versus treating of any other country, treatment of any other country. Double standards. Delegitimization, Zionism is racism. The worst thing you can say to today's Western civilization, the killer label you can apply to any enemy, movement, whatever you want to oppose and defeat and skewer, delegitimize, is racist. And when the UN passed the Zionism is Racism resolution in 1975, even though it was repealed in 1991, the idea of racist, Zionist, colonialist Jews, Israelis, revived the Jewish question, the pre-1945 Jewish question, as the thinkers in Europe had been asking themselves since the Enlightenment, what shall we do with these Jews? How can they be dealt with? Can they be assimilated? Can they be tolerated? Can they be left alone? And we know the story of Zionism, the response to the pogroms, the response to the marginalization and persecution of Jews. The Zionist answer will be normalized when we have our own state. The movement of the delegitimization of Jews to delegitimization of the Jewish state. Anti-Zionism fits very neatly with anti-Semitism, which has always been the epitome of racism. What better than to follow the old Marxist Soviet playbook? And the Zionism is racism resolution came from the Soviet Union and then was adopted by the Arab League. And there you have the nexus of the leftist, Marxist leftist connection with Arab Islamic rejectionism and suppressionism of Jews, and that never went away. And of course, it has now conquered Western academia in the liberal arts. So, the man who committed, the suspect in the Pittsburgh massacres, posted right before that Jews are the spawn of Satan, demonization. And that is an old, as we all know, medieval, early Christian trope, Jews as in league with the devil against Christianity. A few days after the Pittsburgh massacre, a fellow named Louis Farrakhan, one of the country's foremost anti-Semites, gleefully returned to his standard practice of referring to satanic Zionists and evil Jews. Demonization. It can't be any clearer. The difference today in American political discourse versus 20 years ago, let's say, is now there are members of Congress who can't separate themselves from Louis Farrakhan. That's the difference. And they can't because of this, in my opinion, because of this nexus. Story number one. One day in 1988, when I was at AIPAC editing Near East Report, I took the train to New York to the UN to hear a day's worth of the annual debate on the question of Palestine. What question? Since British Mandatory Palestine had gone out of business decades before, and had been succeeded by two successor states, Jordan and Israel, and the only question could be legally, historically, diplomatically, over the unallocated disputed 5% of the former mandate, that would be the West Bank and Gaza. What question of Palestine? But I understood that this was really a debate, not a debate, a monologue about the question of Israel. So the main haranguer at that day's debate was Farouk Kaddoumi, the PLO's so-called foreign minister. And Kaddoumi went on, indicting Israel for this sin, this grievous aggression, crime against the Palestinians, one after the other. And that was pretty much what I saw that day in New York. I understood that this was about the question of Israel. It wasn't about the Palestinian Arabs. It wasn't about the question of Palestine. This was the lever. It was a question of Israel. And should there be a Jewish state? And if you listen to this, what went on that day, the answer was quite clearly no. This was 1988. It's already 30 years ago. Story number 2. A few years later, 1991, I'm managing editor of the Miami Jewish Tribune, the late, great Miami Jewish Tribune. And I was covering Florida Senator Bob Graham's tour of the Miami Beach Holocaust Memorial. Aside, by the way, if you've never seen it, you should make a point. I am not, by nature, a big fan of memorials to the destruction of European Jewry. They should be memorialized, but I myself I've been to Auschwitz, I've been to Birkenau, I've been to Sachsenhausen. I have seen memorials. If you haven't been to the Miami Beach Holocaust Memorial, go. It's a combination sculpture, it's outdoors, combination sculpture garden and outdoor museum. It's extremely well done. So Senator Graham is touring this, and accompanying him is a historian from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I'm walking along and I'm listening to her explanation to Graham why the Holocaust happened. And I'm waiting for her to get to the guts of the story. She's talking about the Versailles Treaty, the unjust reparations the Germans felt, hyperinflation, Germany, and unemployment, and it's like economic, it's political. And after she was done, Graham leaves, and I turned to her and I said, okay, there's hyperinflation. You got to take a wheelbarrow full of marks to go buy vegetables. And Germany has to pay heavy reparations to the Allies. And you turn around and start throwing millions of Jews, and because of that you start throwing millions of Jews into a gas chamber, something's missing. You don't have the whole story here. She was very offended by that and went into another generalization about why the Holocaust happened. And I left thinking, I have a master's degree in American history. I just say that because I left thinking, history is too important to be left to historians. If war is too important to be left to the generals, then the same thing here. Last story. There was something about the Holocaust that this scholar, this woman with a PhD in Holocaust studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, wouldn't go to the bullseye. Last story. My mother was one of 4 sisters, 3 born in the United States. She was the youngest. Her oldest sister, my Aunt Frida, was born in eastern Poland, which was then still part of the Russian Empire. World War I prevented her and my grandmother from joining my grandfather, Louis Mandel, of blessed memory, already in Willard, Ohio. Not the Lower East Side, about as far from that as you could get. Willard, Ohio. One of Aunt Frida's earliest memories, which I remember her telling us when we were children, was of hiding in the root cellar on Easter weekend to avoid drunken peasants incited by the local priest about the Christ-killing Jews. They were looking for Zids to beat. Aunt Frida lived to be 95. The last 20 years or so, not in Bellefontaine, Ohio then. Why anyone would leave these places, I have no idea. but on Miami Beach. The last 20 years or so of her life, Miami Beach. She would occasionally talk by phone with my sister Kathy, who lives in northern Israel. In 2006, they talked about the Hezbollah rocket that smashed into a traffic circle about a quarter mile from my sister's house during the Second Lebanon War. My sister and her husband spent much of the war, those 33 days, in their safe room, their very nice duplex that they had there in Carmiel before they moved to Haifa. All Israeli homes, as you know, built since 1991, and Saddam Hussein's Scud missile attacks are supposed to have a safe room. Reinforced ceiling, window with metal shutters, and a rubber gasket, so you can seal against basically shrapnel, small rockets, gas. And so that's where their safe room was a very nice bedroom. And that's where they spent a lot of the 2006 war. And afterwards I thought, my sister was telling me about these phone calls, and afterwards I thought, from Aunt Frida as a 4-year-old, 1918, hiding in a root cellar, from incited Polish peasants, to my sister and my brother-in-law in their safe room in Israel, protecting them, sheltering from incited Lebanese Shiite Hezbollah, trying to kill Jews a century later, or nearly so. But in Israel, that every house has to have a safe room is considered normal. Because of the Jewish question, what shall we do for, about, and with the Jews, it's considered normal that the Jews, in their Jewish state, of all people, should have a safe room. Not just a safe room, but gas masks. And not just gas masks, but for the infants, these little tents. No other people. I try in this book to answer the question, why? Why is that? And why has this compulsion to marginalize, if not eliminate the Jews, to re-ghettoize? When I talk about this theme, I am not saying that in the West, and it's certainly not in the United States, even in Europe, where just today, JTA, Jewish Telegraphic Agency, reported that at the International Holocaust Memorial Commemoration Day, leaders of the European Jewish community discussed whether it was safe to remain in Europe. And Isaac Herzog, the new head of the Jewish Agency for Israel, noted that it's not safe for Jews to identifiably walk the streets of Europe today. A man with a kippah. The more things change, the less they change. Why? So that's why I felt compelled. When the idea came to me about 6 years ago, you need to really, after all this time, deal with why that historian wouldn't tell you what she thought and wouldn't tell Senator Graham what really causes this obsession, murderous obsession, enduring with the Jews, and that now has been transferred, Zionism is racism, to the Jewish state. As I write in the book, the functional position of the government of Iran today is the Holocaust never happened and we intend to finish it. Why? So that's what the book is about. And at the end, what we can do or what we should do about it. So let me just read a few passages and then open the floor or sell books. So mostly from the beginning. In chapter 1. The most useful lever in anti-Semitism's return to the norm, incorporating demonization, delegitimization, as well as double standards, has been the lie of Palestine, the so-called Palestinian narrative. It turns out Theodore Herzl, Leon Pinsker, and Max Nordau were wrong. They and other fathers of political Zionism believed the anti-Semitism flooding Europe at the end of the 19th century resulted from Jewish statelessness. return them to their ancient status as a sovereign people, and the Jews too, like Europe's re-emerging independent nationalities, including Greeks, Italians, and Germans, in their newly sovereign or newly unified states, no longer would be suspected strangers in lands not their own. Instead, they would be normalized in their new old land, the Alta New Land of Herzl's Zionist work. But it didn't work out that way. Rather, indigenous Middle Eastern anti-Semitism, particularly that rooted in Arab Sunni Muslim imperialism, found itself reinvigorated by an incipient Islamism promoted during World War I by Imperial Germany to bolster Ottoman Turkey's fight against Great Britain and France. It received a more thorough accelerant via World War II propaganda funded and trained from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. This European imperialism manifested itself in an Arab nationalist form in mid-20th century with Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser and his pan-Arabism, and in the competing Ba'ath, B-A-A-T-H, parties in Syria and Iraq. Ba'ath in Arabic means renewal. And renewal in Arabic was used commonly in Nazi propaganda to Arab audiences during World War II, especially that broadcast by the Palestinian George Washington, Haj Amin al-Husseini. And Ba'ath Party leaders acknowledged that what they found inspirational in the Third Reich was its strongman leadership principle, its highly organized society, as Germany before and during the war, and its genocidal hatred of Jews. That has along that German effort to motivate Ottoman Turkey and its Muslim subjects to first rebel against and later fight against German and French colonialism, has a long history in coming out of Germany from the 1890s all the way through 1945. And that's why Haj Amin al-Husseini ended up in Berlin making those shortwave broadcasts to the Arab world. One of his listeners, one of his millions of listeners, beyond the Palestinian Arabs, beyond the Egyptians who would become active in the Muslim Brotherhood, was a young Iranian religious student named Ruhollah Khomeini. The connection is, the dots are there to be connected. Why, except for academics and scholars, and now more and more journalists, and Sean being one of the foremost among them, connecting these dots has taken so long, I don't know. But there it is. And how it worked. I'll just bring this forward slightly. After Israel's Six-Day War victory, this combination of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism became more obvious and more extensive. And it increasingly became a universal antidote to European guilt over both pervasive Jew hatred that led to the Holocaust and colonial crimes in Africa. You see, it's very neat. The Jews in Israel get it both ways. The Europeans can't bear their guilt over what they did or what their civilization and their parents or grandparents' generation did. So psychologically, that's too strong to bear. So any Freudian 101 would tell you they project it on the victim, on the Jews. Secondly, it works another way because it lets them expiate their own colonial crimes, because now they can side with a colonized people, not the Jews, the Palestinian Arabs. So the Jews got it coming and going. Legendary Nazi hunter Beata Klarsfeld, for example, saw one instance of this tendency after the Six-Day War in leftist German students finding it more convenient, quote, to demonstrate on behalf of the Palestinians than to reckon with the crimes of their own fathers. And maybe one more. This is from Chapter 2, which is headed Denial, Revisionism, and Narrative. In 2007, a 22-year-old man who called Elie Wiesel's account of the Holocaust fictitious pulled him out of a hotel elevator in San Francisco and attacked him. The attacker's name was Eric Hunt, who, when convicted on false imprisonment, felony hate crime charges a year later, was described as a troubled New Jersey man. He had yanked Wiesel out of the elevator in an attempt to persuade him to renounce the Holocaust. But metaphysically, his name could have been Hashemi al-Husseini, or that of al-Husseini's relative and ideological heir, Yasser Arafat, or Arafat's successor as the head of the PLO, Mahmoud Abbas, not to mention many other troubled people, including the countless followers of al-Husseini, Arafat, and Abbas, their apologists, enthusiasts, and competitors, Arab, Muslim, European, North American, Christian, secular, or even Jewish. Any passionate subscriber to the Palestinian narrative will do. And to in synagogue, when the Torah portion is read, and and the Haftorah portion is read, and the prophet will go on about the backsliding and sins and shortcomings of the Jews and how God is going to punish them. And then there's a couple of verses right at the end that says, but don't worry, you will be redeemed and restored to Jerusalem and your rightful place. It's like, whew, your response. So I've just been going on with, my daughters tell me, gloom and doom. We'll finish on that up note, or what I hope is an up note, and it's how I finished the book. Two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Barbara Tuchman introduced one of her early books, Bible and Sword, England and Palestine from the Bronze Age to Balfour, which came out in 1956, with this observation. So the rest is a quote. The history of the Jews is intensely peculiar in the fact of having given the Western world its concepts of origins and monotheism, its ethical traditions, and the founder of its prevailing religion, yet suffering dispersion, statelessness, and ceaseless persecution, and finally in our times nearly successful genocide, dramatically followed by fulfillment of the never relinquished dream of return to their homeland. Viewing this strange and singular history, one cannot escape the impression that it must contain some special significance for the history of mankind, that in some way, whether one believes in divine purpose or inscrutable circumstance, the Jews have been singled out to carry the tale of human fate. That's Tuchman's quote, and I just finished by adding Viktor Frankl, whom I cite. Viktor Frankl, who the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust in the camps to write Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl said, after the Holocaust, we understand there are only two races, quote unquote, races of people, those who are decent and those who are not. The enemies of the Jews, of the Jewish idea, of the Jewish state, are in that race who are not the decent people. And those who support the Jews, Israel, the idea of a Jewish state, of Jewish equality, those who support that are in the race of the decent people. Apparently threatened in one way or another by that circumstance, those in the former group seek to destroy the Jewish state and people. That much, at least, is clear, along with the fact that that is what we are fighting against. That and those people, those who hold that idea, is what we reject. Thank you very much. Take questions and whatever. Yes.
Thank you so much. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
I'm a second-generation Holocaust survivor. Both my parents were survivors. And when you mention comparison between the Nazis and the Arabs, I just want to give one anecdote. My mother was interviewed, did one of the Spielberg interview oral histories, and she was asked questions, what did you see? She remembers from the second, third floor window, a Nazi, an SS, throwing a baby to the ground, and she described it as going splat on the ground. What is the difference in that from what happened not long ago, that a baby in Israel is targeted and shot and killed in the bullet to the head by a sniper? What's the difference? It's not because that is anti-Zionism that baby was killed. It's anti-Semitism. I'm just agreeing. I mean,
right.
Can we go with an anecdote that absolutely.
And we're in complete agreement. And this is, to me, the point of relating the story of my aunt's experience as a 4-year-old and my sister's experience as a middle-aged woman, and everything that has happened in between. And yet that hatred, that unreasoning hatred, oh, that's a mistake. I said unreasoning. We're in agreement. The only thing that I will add or embellishment, I have heard Holocaust survivors, and not just Holocaust survivors, I've heard the head of ADL and people in between say things like, after an anti-Semitic incident, or in relating their experience, you know, it was, and they were attacked, it happened only because they were Jews. And I just want to pull out what remaining hair I have and say, they were attacked exactly because they were Jews, and that's the only justification, that's the only pretext necessary. And until you understand that that's not an accident, the throwing of the baby off the balcony and the killing of that baby in Hebron. I have another anecdote in the book, just like that. It's not that one, but it's very similar, because of course they're not singular. Yes?
I have a question. When my fully Jewish grandson, 19 over, most of my family's pretty conservative, tells me that his generation, not him, but his generation considers Israel a racist country, was very difficult weekend for me. But I just finished a book that you probably know, To Heal the World.
Yes.
You know, okay. And that's my question. I don't know that you can answer it. I'm going to read the book. When we have now, and I'm 76, I'm not a baby, when we have now the larger part of the Jewish community, and Newman points this out in his book. I mean, the subtitle of the book is how liberal Judaism is essentially destroying Judaism and endangering Israel. We have now, and I live amongst them, Jews who are communists, who are liberals, quotes, and they call themselves the good people, and I see my people, okay? Lost a hell of a lot of family in Holocaust Street, telling me that they're the good people, the ones you talk about. And they're anti-Semitic. I have so many anti-Semitic Jews around me. Where do we go? What do we do?
I talk about that problem, and I discuss it in the book, and in some detail, but I hope I'm not, what's telling tales out of school, that's not the right term. I hope I'm not getting too far ahead of the story here, but when Juliana's next book comes out, the origins and the depth of that, why they can think that way, of that problem, and how it has actually led to repeated disasters for societies wherever that belief system has taken hold. And Juliana, Utopians of Babel. And Juliana's, do you want to?
Well, no, what I would like to do is to invite you to read right now a magnificent book, which I reviewed just the other day, by Robert Wistrich, Wistrich. He died prematurely at the mere age of 70 in 2015. But this was his magnum opus, and it is called From Ambivalence to Betrayal. The Jews, the left, and Israel, and anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism. It's a magnificent book because it is specifically about the contribution of Jews, such as Karl Marx, to anti-Semitism. And it's a very sophisticated book that is the culmination of his entire life.
What's the name of the book again?
From Ambivalence to Betrayal.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll be more than happy to share my review of this that just came out 2 days ago from Law and Liberty, because it links it to the Women's March.
And I want to come back to your specific question. When I was at Camera in particular, I dealt with Jewish college students who could not explain why they were pro-Israel, when all their peers, the peer group that they wanted to belong to, if they paid any attention at all to these issues, were so hostile. And the idea that they've convinced themselves they're the good people. And if you don't agree with them, then it's not just that you're mistaken, you're a bad person, you're evil, and therefore you're not going to be engaged in dialogue, you're going to be shunned and marginalized. That's an old totalitarian technique, and they've learned it from their professors. And this is the problem in the humanities departments in many places today. They're anything but humane. But what's happening, the way I understand the Jewish community, the further you get from, I'm hesitating. Okay, I'll say it directly, and then we can filter it if we need to. The further you get from observance, the further you get from orthodoxy, and I don't mean we all have to go around wearing kippot and being orthodox. I mean the further you get from that matrix, the more attenuated your ability to connect with Jewish peoplehood. The Jews as a distinct group becomes, and therefore the more like a chameleon you look for protective coloration. You realize you're in an environment, your larger environment is becoming increasingly hostile to what you used to be, or what you used to want to affiliate with. So rather than intensify that connection, you look, how do you blend in? You look for camouflage. And then you convince yourself, because all human beings, it's right up there, eating, sleeping, breathing, drinking, procreating, self-justification. That's right up there on the list. And because we all want to feel psychologically whole, we tell ourselves that's not what we're doing. We're the good people. The left long ago confiscated the vocabulary of humanitarianism. And you see that politically across the board. And young Jews have such a hard time. But Judaism is the religion of universal values and compassion and social justice. As soon as you say that, tikkun olam. I have spent a couple pages on how, before Newman's book, on how tikkun olam has been yanked out of context, yanked out of its Jewish context, and universalized to the point of being able to be used against Israel, the most just society in the Middle East. Okay.
Wait, can I just add on to that?
Oh, absolutely, boss.
Okay, in that case, I'm going to add on to that thought. Which is to say that it doesn't only operate in the Jewish context. I think it needs to be said out loud. It operates in the political context of the the United States, where the media tells you that if you are of one particular persuasion, you're a racist. If you wear a hat of a certain color, you're a racist. If you go to a pro-life march thinking that you're marching about one particular political point, it's a racist march. So that which has been applied to the Jews, we are seeing increasingly across the board, and a large part of the Jewish community hangs with that. They are of the left. They are willing to go in that direction. So Jews find themselves on the outs with Jews. Thank you, Eric.
Okay, I'm gonna go like this, and we'll be real fast.
You don't have to,
We'll
we
do-
got
Well,
a little
okay.
time, not too much.
So here, and there.
Okay.
Yes, here.
My name is Peter Rozenman, QC. The reason my middle name is my Jewish family fled Nazi Germany when Hitler came to power.
I'm sorry,
My
can you speak up a little bit?
My grandfather had arranged to get out of Germany. And one of his students at the University of Leipzig Law School was Helmut James Graf von Moltke, who was the leader of the Kreisau Circle, which was the group that put the bomb under Hitler's desk in 1944. Helmut unfortunately was arrested before that for saving Jews, Catholics, and a whole lot of people from going to the camps. And his widow came to America to live with my grandfather after my grandmother had passed. And she lived there for till a couple years ago. She passed away at 99. They never got married, they just lived together. And she became my dearest friend in the world. She wrote a book on her husband's letters that were smuggled out of prison when he was in prison in Germany. And he had communion every day, and the guards couldn't figure out why. The reason is the priest smuggled out his letters that were written on what was then toilet paper with a fine little piece of lead pencil. And he wrote that the grievance theory of why people do horrible things is very common, because if you notice in America, as soon as a guy shoots 14 people, everybody says, why? What was his motive? Shoshana came up a number of years ago with a quote from Bill Clinton, who said, if you gave the Palestinians a state, 2/3 or more of the terrorism in the world would disappear. Ron Paul, in the debate with the Republican candidates, said, everybody knows why we got attacked on 9/11. We had American soldiers were in Saudi Arabia, and Osama bin Laden was pissed. The grievance theory of terrorism, I've written about it, and this is, I think, the key of that historian at the Holocaust Museum, is that we all want to see this go away, what's going on in the Middle East. We want peace. So why is it going on? And you can find, well, if Israel just gave the Palestinian state, for crying out loud and whatever, things would take care of themselves, and we wouldn't have to send a soldier over there, and Iraq and Afghanistan would go on, and terrorism, and take care of that problem. And it's a shorthand for not being honest with yourself, because if you face the fact the Islamic world has killed 250 million people, according to one professor, it's on YouTube, by the way, every major battle in Islamic history, 530, every major civilization they've gone after, killed hundreds of thousands of people in India. So when you go there,
You're not allowed.
that is what we don't address, because if it's not that the Jews aren't giving the Palestinian state, that ain't the issue. If Islam and call it more radical if we want, but if in fact we're facing hatred, it's just like racism against black people in America, that's not because the folks in some parts of the country, Roxbury or
Right.
Selma, don't have
Jobs or-
healthcare
right,
programs. Okay, it's like the mayor of New York said about the terrorist who was the car bomber that didn't go off, thank God. He said, well, we didn't have healthcare. So unless we address that fundamental falsehood, we don't get to where we're going.
I agree with you, and I talk in the book a little bit about, well, I start with the example. After after we threw the Taliban out in Afghanistan, the old Afghan traditional sport of bashkazi, I think I'm pronouncing it right, was reintroduced. It looks like polo, but it's the thing that's being driven up and down the field is a goat carcass. It's not a polo, Chuck. It's a goat carcass, and the Taliban had banned that. It's ancient game. Once the Taliban were overthrown, back came Bushkazi. The Jews have been the goat carcass. It's not about grievance, always, or mainly. It's about who's up and who's down. Whose property can I take? Whose women can I rape? Who can I expropriate? Who's up and who's down? And if you take a traditional society, a society where the Jews have traditionally explicitly been down, in Arabic, Haj Amin al-Husseini revived the slogan, or just used the slogan, the Palestine is our land and the Jews are our dogs. It rhymes in Arabic. It's much better. I have it in the book phoneticized. Palestine is our land and the Jews are our dogs. 1920s, the big pogroms in Palestine. 2003, demonstration out in front of the White House against the war in Iraq. Palestine is our land, and the Jews are our dogs. Some of the people were hollering in Arabic. Not very many, a few. You're absolutely right. Who can I get away with the perverse human desire to oppress another human being? The decent versus the indecent people. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to make an observation, particularly on your comment. I think a lot of us as Jews, we're experiencing a sense of social isolation. My wife and I have spent the last 2 partial winters in Arizona, and we have gotten to know some people in Scottsdale. And they experienced basically what I think we are perhaps all experiencing to some degree, that a lot of what were our supposed liberal democratic friends started peeling off if we were to dare express a different, more conservative point of view, and we become effectively ostracized from our own communities, our own shuls. We belong to one of the major conservative shuls in the District of Columbia, and I dare perish the thought of even bringing a speaker such as yourself as for consideration to speak to the congregation, because it would be tantamount to banishment. So therefore, what are strategies and solutions? In Scottsdale, the shul and organization we linked up with had a setup informally called what they referred to as DINCON, D-I-N-C-O-N, Dinner with Conservatives. And what it effectively meant was that like-minded people with like-minded points of view got together, socialized, discussed issues of the day, because dare they speak these concerns before their own congregations, you know, they'd be drawn and quartered. Yeah. So perhaps really what we need to think about is strategies to implement for the here and now. Because I think short of a new pandemic in the Middle East that will wipe out hundreds of millions of people, you know, our discourse today isn't going to mean a Tinker's Dam in terms of changing the paradigm and the dynamic in the Middle East. I really believe that. So I think what we're confronted with is, what do we do to shepherd ourselves together in some fashion where we don't have this sense of social isolation and ostracization from our own religion and our own religious affiliations.
You have just described a urgent core issue, and I couldn't agree more. I would add, since you said that, I would have been remiss, especially this discussion that we've been having, not to have mentioned the environment in which we're working, in which this ostracization happens, this marginalization, in which people do not anymore, increasingly rarely have dialogue across political differences. We need to understand that, I don't like to use the term anymore, liberal. I actually consider myself a liberal conservative, or conservative liberal. And that's not being wishy-washy. It's how I've thought of myself for 30 years. When I came to Washington as a Democrat to work for a Jewish Democratic member of Congress. And how I still think of myself, advocating conservative policies and conservative principles at the Jewish Policy Center for the Republican Jewish Coalition. I still think of myself but what's happened is, and I talk about this in the book, there are still liberals. The Adlai Stevenson, Hubert Humphrey, Henry Scoop Jackson, Democrats, or people of that, but a lot of them they became the neoconservatives. What's happened on the left, the liberal side of the ledger kept moving left, if the right kept moving right, look, secular fundamentalists, the people who we are now dealing with on the left who think they're liberals, who want to ban free speech on certain subjects, and who want to shout down the opposition, these are not liberals. They have the vocabulary, they hijacked the vocabulary. These are secular fundamentalists, and their politics, their ideology is their religion, and it's their faith. And you can't question a person's religion. That, you can have an interfaith dialogue, but you're not going to change any minds. That's not designed to change minds. You got to understand that the people over there on the other side that are marginalizing conservatives, and especially conservative Jews and Zionists, coming from secular fundamentalists, they're not reachable by traditional political discussion. So they got to be going after another way. You've been very patient,
And
yes.
this will be the last question.
Okay, I'll just hang around with people that I
Wait,
didn't get
but
to.
we have to be
Yeah.
conscious of our hosts.
So Bernard Henri Lévy wrote a number of years ago about how American Jews were lulled into a sense of complacency because they had adopted so strictly their historical institutions like the Democratic Party and decided that this was their, I hate using this expression too, safe space, for where they could stand and always defend them. I think, what has been difficult for people to understand, and you mentioned your 19-year-old relative on this, is I think they don't understand that hatred is visceral. It's not defined by historical accuracy, it's defined by revisionism, it's described by making things illegitimate that are really legitimate, it's defined by what happened 2,000 years ago in a different way than it actually occurred. And I think I think young people like to belong to something. I'm very Groucho Marx. I would never join a club that would have me as a member. but I'm different. And so haters want to belong to a club that'll have them as a member. Young Jewish kids on college campuses don't want to be isolated. And so they adopt things that are, really, you have people chortling behind their collective backs and laughing at them because they're really held in visceral contempt, but they don't realize it yet. So my question is, in this sort of circular logic, and I agree with what you just said, I mean, look at the questions that were asked by Dianne Feinstein, a Jew, and by Kamala Harris of Catholic nominees. I'm not going to get into a debate about what I think of Kavanaugh or anyone else or Neil Gorsuch. I think the fact that you were allowed to ask if someone's religion, prevented them from making a decision that would be constitutional. I worked at the State Department for over 30 years, and we were subject to what I call the Jewish litmus test. Like, you can't really work on Israel because you're Jewish and your patriotism is called into question. So I thought what they did was reprehensible because it harkened back to J. Edgar Hoover and everyone else who had a long history of this. So my question to you is, how do you convince people that their adoption of an institution in which they have felt incredibly comfortable and grown increasingly complacent over many decades, no longer has their best interests at heart.
I don't know if I want to write that book or not. Okay, a fourth story. Also from the same time period, the summer of 1988, Democratic National Convention was in progress. I'm editor of Near East Report at AIPAC. Another young fellow, I was younger then, fellow who went on to become the head of a federation in a major urban city. Then he was a he was a lobbyist, he was an AIPAC lobbyist. And the Democratic National Convention was on, and they were about to nominate Michael Dukakis. And AIPAC was trying to be scrupulously nonpartisan, but the Dukakis people, somebody running the convention had decided to give speaking time to James Zogby, then the head of the Arab American AAA, the Arab American Association, whatever. Zogby had come to our attention, of course, because he had been an advocate, and it's in the book, I think, for a Palestinian terrorist, a man who murdered a couple of Israelis named Abu Zaim, and he'd somehow gotten into the United States, was living in the United States. And Israel wanted him deported, and AIPAC wanted him deported. And Zogby was fighting to retain him and saying, you know, he was being scapegoated by the Israelis. And the Democrats gave Zogby platform, speaking time. It was papered over because they decided they gave him speaking time in the afternoon. So he wasn't on in prime time. That's 1988. And we're arguing with each other, the two of us. I said, you know, it's going to get harder and harder for pro-Israel Jews to be active in the Democratic Party. The more the Democratic Party is anti-military and unwilling to support America's allies militarily. And what ally does it support so heavily militarily? Israel. I said, there's a flaw, there's a fault line looming here, and it's going to cause a split. He said, that's not going to happen. It's not we're too well established in the party, and we're too well integrated, and you're projecting worst case scenario, never going to happen. So was it 2012 or 2012 Democratic Convention? On the platform writing committee are James Zogby, and he's no longer a small speaking role, not in prime time, and the professor at Gates, Henry Louis Gates. Both of them believers in the idea that the Israelis have massacred large numbers of Palestinians. And how did they get on the platform writing committee? Because a Jewish senator named Bernie Sanders, who was nearly the nominee, so it must have been 2016, nearly the nominee, put him there. And that's the distance the party and some of us have traveled in 30 years. I don't know how to reverse it. The reversal will have to start with the youngest people. I'm not going to reverse it at the top with Bernie Sanders and James Zogby and those people, the people at the top. You're going to reverse it at the lower level, at the younger level. Thank you very much. Thank you.